Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again. It is Tuesday. It's 4 o'clock Eastern. And in the world of data management and big data analytics and cloud and all that fun stuff, that means one thing. It's time once again for the briefing room. Yes, indeed. My name is Eric Cavanaugh. I will be your host for the show that is designed, after all, to peel away the marketing veneer, get down to brass tacks, and figure out what is going on in the field of information management. And folks, what isn't going on these days? I think that's the easier question to answer. So the exact title of today's show is A Bigger Magnifying Glass, Analyzing the Internet of Things. It's a hot topic, folks. We're going to dive into the details here in a moment. As many of you know, the whole mission of the briefing room, which is ending year 7 right now, by the way. We're starting year 8 in 2017. Is to reveal the essential characteristics of enterprise software. We do that by hosting live analyst briefings. You, as an audience member, play a significant role. So ask questions. Don't be shy. We have 2 experts on the line today, and they've been doing a lot of research into this space. So the topic of today, very quickly, the IoT. Well, lots of interesting stuff is happening. Perhaps many of you experienced, I think it was earlier this week or late last week, a lot of websites crashed. There were sites that were just down. Twitter was down, Constant Contact was down, Spotify was down, lots and lots of sites went down, and it turns out there was a massive denial of service attack that went on the DNS servers. I think DIN was the company, DIN, that was attacked, and apparently what was happening is lots of IoT devices were turned against their makers, if you will, and they sent tons and tons of requests to these DNS servers simultaneously. Well, what happens then is you get a choke point, and that choke point caused the Internet to really stumble for a while. There are some fears, frankly, that it was just a test run, that someone may have been playing around and is planning on doing more of a full blast at some point in time, and that is one of the downsides for the Internet of Things. So we're going to talk about that today. But we've got a couple great guests for you. Richard Hackathorn from Boulder Technologies on the line. He's done a lot of really good research into this IoT space. And also Dan Graham of Teradata. And so, folks, first of all, I'm going to go ahead and push this slide and let Richard start us off. Take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I'm going to start on the positive side of Internet of Things, and later on I think we should touch on that security issue that Eric brought up. But when Dan and I were putting together this webinar, we were thinking to ourselves, well, should we what's the perspective we should have here? Most people think of Internet of Things as sensors like thermostats. You know, if it's too hot in your room, you turn on the air conditioner. If it's too cold, you turn on the heater, and the time of day determines what's hot and what's cold. And that's an operational control system. What we thought we'd do is to focus more on the business strategy end of things, and from that perspective, I think a magnifying glass is good. I listed a whole bunch of, shall we say, waves of technology that have passed over information systems over the past several decades, you know, from the early transaction systems. Each one of these were kind of a magnifying glass in a way. That is, they showed what was happening inside your organization. You were able to understand your business better. You were able to manage it better, and hopefully make it more successful, more revenue, and all that good stuff. So we've gone through a lot of magnifying glasses in IT over the decades, and IoT really is kind of an exciting new twist on this whole series here. It's a magnifying glass because we can sense so much more detail about our business ecosystem. Now, what we do with that and how that's going to drive business strategy is really the topic of today. So where we're going to go in this seminar is that, first of all, Dan and I are going to go over a study we did earlier this year that looked at 8 companies that had some fairly large-scale IoT applications in production, and were making a difference in their companies. And then we're going to shift focus about more about what's happening with these applications and how they're being used to drive business strategy. And unfortunately, most executives are kind of clueless about how IoT and the analysis of IoT data can drive business strategy, and that's what we want to focus on in the last slides. Why should executives care about IoT? Next slide. The ecosystem of Internet of Things is quite large. I mean, essentially, you can instrument, sense just about every activity in your business. And companies have been doing this for decades in terms of monitoring widgets off the assembly line, people's and business processes from all edges, all areas of the business. And what's happened more recently is that these sensors have not only gotten cheaper, they've gotten smarter, and they've been interconnected. And that's where we've made a more recent transition over the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, from just isolated sensors that just did simple things to more smarter sensors that were interconnected. This is where you get into the edge computing area, which Dan will go into more detail on, but that's the operational control. That's the doing end of this whole ecosystem. It's where we receive signals. It's a thermostat essentially. If the room is too cold, so let's turn on the furnace type of mentality there. Where we see the most exciting things is in that orange circle there, and that's the analytics of things, or longer phrase, it's the analysis of IoT data to drive the entire business cross-functionally. So the analytics of things is going to be one of the main themes here, and what we're going to focus on is how analytics of things is going to drive business value. I'll turn it over to Dan on the next slide.
Hey, thanks, Richard. So we just wanted to postulate a very simple architectural thought. It's not a deep architecture of just what we're talking about today, which is that the things which are on the left, which are operational technology, these are something being monitored. It could be a manufacturing line. It could be an RFID tag stuck on some clothing article. A lot of people should understand there's at least 6 or 7 computers in every modern car, so it's full of sensors and full of operational technology. And this whole community of things lives in the real world, and it's called the edge. And it's called the edge because these things are out on the edge of the network. So they're not part of your intranet, not part of the internet typically, but they are out there on the edge. Some of them are inside the intranet, but a lot of them are going to be running around in the wild. So cars, they don't sit still. People don't sit still. So a lot of different things are being monitored. And as they send that data out of the sensors, and the sensors can detect temperature and pressure and wind velocity and all these different things, that data has to go somewhere. One of the places it's becoming extremely popular is a gateway, and a gateway can be a very small, tiny router with enough compute power to do some work. Normally it changes protocols and flips over to TCP/IP. But you can also go to something like a Dell 5000 gateway server, which is a fairly healthy little processor, a couple hundred gigabytes of storage, some memory, and running all kinds of software. So gateways have a number of different characteristics, but the data comes through there, and then you as the builder of this environment decide whether you're going to send the data into the cloud or to your data center, and ultimately get to the analytics of things where it's really going to happen. That's where the ROI pops out. So, Eric, what do you think about this edge gateway concept?
Well, I tell you, I think it's one of the most promising areas of technology today, and this whole concept of edge analytics really does fundamentally change the game for how companies can leverage not just data, but insights some of these use cases can be a bit strange in terms of the privacy issues, but as long as you accept the push notifications, for example, you can now get some really interesting offers as you're walking around the shopping mall. For example, you mentioned the gateway here. If that happens to be a router that's somewhere in a shopping mall, well, it can be tracking you when you walk in because you have the app for whatever the department store is, for example, and as you're walking around, it can actually sense when you're getting near the exit and throw you an advertisement that says, oh, wait, did you know this is 50% off today only? Well, it's pretty sophisticated to put together a bit of business logic like that. It's pretty much of a challenge to get that up and running. But once you do, if you have something of that nature, this becomes a very compelling use case because now you can help somebody out. And you can think, too, in all sorts of other use cases where that would be highly valuable. Think about, for example, some of these apps like Waze, for example, where you're driving. I mean, I remember thinking to myself, and I'm kind of kicking myself really, probably 15 years ago, once the internet was up and running and everybody was online, wow, I was thinking, wow, I'd love to have the ability to work with one of these companies that builds the police radar detectors, because you could gather information and send it back to subscribers and let them know there's a cop over the hill, stuff like that. But that's what we're talking about these days, is that capacity to rethink business process, especially around issues like geospatial, but really any kind of business process. Suddenly you've hit this inflection point where you can really turn whole processes inside out, and that is incredibly useful stuff. So with that, I think back over to Richard.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Eric, in terms of the impacts that some of these new applications are and can have. But I think one of the messages that Dan and I want to say here is that without the blue right side of this diagram, a lot of the things that happen in the gateway are limited, are not so smart. And just knowing that there's a person present next to a certain product in your store doesn't give you enough smarts to really launch the proper ad to that person until you see what their past behavior is. And that's laying back on the right side of this diagram. So Dan, why don't you finish this off, and let's get into some of the examples then.
Okay, let's finish this off. Next.
Okay. And this is my slide. So let me tell you about an interesting situation. If you're ever in Madrid or Barcelona, one way to get to the other city is by train. There's a high-speed train, 200 miles an hour, and the interesting, it's about a 3-hour journey at that speed. The interesting thing is that it's totally reliable. Well, why, how, and so what is the thing. So here's one of the quotes from Siemens, that was one of the contractors for the Spanish Ministry of Public Transportation. In a 3-hour journey, only one out of over 2,000 journeys were delayed by more than 5 minutes. Now, think about that a second. How many journeys could there be per day? Well, there's at least 2, going both directions, but there's probably 4, 5, 6 or so. Essentially, what we're talking about is that over the span of an entire year, there was only one train that was more than 5 minutes late. Now, how do you operate a sophisticated high-speed train like that? It's sensors, and Siemens engineered this particular transportation system to deliver that level of reliability. But the story doesn't stop there. What's really neat about that is that it gives the Ministry of Public Transportation some new business strategies. 80% of a few years ago, 80% of people going from Madrid to Barcelona took the airplane. That is now down to 30%, a 50% drop in people taking airplanes. They're now taking the train because they know they will be there on time with a minimum amount of hassle. So they had the idea of saying, we'll guarantee your fare if it's more than an hour late. Well, you know, just think that's a way of driving business to this particular service. So IoT allows us to manage complex systems, such as this high-speed train, and do so with a high degree of reliability. Now, we're going to go through in the next slide, starting a series of examples that sort of probe down a little bit more. And Dan, why don't you take it from there?
Right, so these are Teradata customers who are using sensor data today. This is not whiteboard theory. This is people that actually did this kind of application and are still doing it. Some of them have been doing it for a while, like the railroads. And in this particular railroad, they have 32,000 miles of track and over 3,000 trains going down that every day. Now, you have to understand they own the track and they own the locomotives. They don't own the cars, and they certainly don't own what Mother Nature may or may not do to their vehicles as they move through the mountainsides and wherever. So the biggest problem that you have if you're a other than maintaining all this equipment, but the biggest problem you fear is a derailment. If you imagine, you know, a 50-ton machine that falls over off the track on a mountainside, it's always an inconvenient location. You now have a track that's no longer functioning. You have to bring in all this equipment to pick it up and put it back on the tracks. And then, of course, there could be damage to some of the goods. Now, what's not obvious to the public or people like me until I ran into this customer is that when you have this 60 or 80-ton locomotive moving down the track, it basically has 16 steel wheels. Those 16 steel wheels fit on about the size of a quarter on the track. So that's a lot of pressure on a very small part of the track as it rolls down the track at 50 to 70 or 80 miles per hour. So what happens is as the engineer hits the brakes, the steel wheels push back on the steel track, of course. That's the friction that slows us down. And it's that quarter, that small spot that's getting all of that tonnage and all of that heat all at once pushing back. And the consequence is that it creates a small flat spot on the wheel. Now, it's not real serious until you've done it, you know, for many times over a several-month period. But eventually, these flat spots cause the wheels to get out of round. Now, you wouldn't think it's such a big deal. These are huge wheels, these steel wheels, but it is, because what happens is when they start to wobble, they start to put a lot of unusual pressure on the bearings and the axles, and when the bearings and the axles heat up too much, the axle snaps, and that's when the locomotive goes off the track. So this particular company had laid sensors every 20 miles along these 32,000 miles of track, and basically had an infrared sensor to look for heat in the axle, and they also had an audio sensor to pick up the screeching sound of the steel wheels as they go by, because we know they're all noisy, but the human ear doesn't hear this particular kind of screeching that indicates this particular wheel is overheating. It is getting close to a point where it will actually snap the axle and derail. So with these 20 million sensor readings a day, they're picking up from their dashboards and their analytic headquarters, they're picking up the fact that there's 1,500 issues to be thinking about, not tragedies, just things to be planning for our maintenance schedules. And they can bring these locomotives off the tracks well in advance of any of these derailments happening. They can save a lot of problems, a lot of cost, they can save lives, they can do a lot of good things just by knowing 30 to 60 days in advance, hey, we need to slow this particular locomotive down, bring it into the repair shop, fix up those wheels, and put it back on the tracks. So this particular company is now in the process of upgrading all of their sensors on that 32,000 miles of track because they certainly found the value in this capability. So we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, real quick, I'll just chime in. I think that is a really fascinating use case. You just mentioned the fact that there are sensors which pick up the audio of the screech, right? Typically, we think of sensors as just figuring out whether or not there is electricity running through a particular circuit or what the voltage is or whatever the case may be. But an actual audio sensor that listens for a high pitch of a screech, that is really cool stuff. Let me go ahead and pull
Yeah, and the machines are moving along at about 50 miles an hour as they come into the stations. Yep, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'd also say that I think the ultimate sensor is going to be the webcam. Once we get computer vision analytics, essentially you can measure a lot of different things by just looking at sequences of images and deriving the activities and things from those images. So, you know, audio is first step. I think we're going to see a whole new area of sensors in the future.
Absolutely. So, this particular story is about, actually we have several customers at Teradata who are doing this kind of thing, which is electric utilities. And what they, of course, have done is started putting in smart meters in various homes. Now, you should know that the people in Europe, particularly in the Nordic regions, have done this a lot more effectively, a lot longer than the Americans. And this is more of a hit or miss throughout the USA. But the customers that we have already installed the smart meters, and they've used this metering program where they can get the scoring on how much electricity you've used. They can figure it out every 10 to 15 minutes. And the consequence is that a lot of them have put in peak utilization period tracking so that they can offer different pricing schemes. Now, I live here in Silicon Valley, up in the Silicon Artist area of San Francisco, and they put this on me. My wife signed up for this. We get a lower price of electricity if we take a hit, if we take some requirement from them, say 10 or 12 days a year, to lower our electrical usage during peak hours. So that basically means slow down the air conditioner, or put it differently, turn the temperature from 74 up to 78. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's not bad. And for this, we get a payback of a lower electrical rate all year long. So they can measure it, and they can determine whether or not, you know, we're running the air conditioner and the washer and the dryer and all those things during the heat of the afternoon. So we just move some of that stuff, like the washer and dryer. We move it off hours. Now, the payback here is the electrical company can then have less requirements. They don't have to pay for as much electricity because they buy a lot of their electricity at auction. They have their own generation systems, and they have to bring some in from out of state. So it's those surge pricings that they can keep a control over by getting the populace, like myself, my wife, to sort of play along and help them out when it's not such a big, dire situation. And it actually pays back for both teams, for my family as well as for the electrical company. So let's go to the next slide. This is a fun one. This is an interesting company. There's a whole lot of interesting things about it. First of all, that machine that you see in the background is really a paper pounding machine, if you will. It's a machine that takes in pulp, takes in chemicals and all kinds of things, and it grinds out sheets of paper. Now, it can grind out 8.5 by 11 sheets of white paper, magazine paper, newspaper, cardboard, tissue for going in your Kleenex box. It can make any kind of paper. The thing is, it's about 100 yards long. It's about the length of a football field, whether it's a soccer field or an American football field. It's huge. And this thing has 10,000 sensors on it. Well, lo and behold, this company wanted to optimize the capabilities of this machine, of course, and they wanted to be able to produce that information for the operator of the machine, because the operator's been using, you know, his ears and his gut feeling and his attitude about, you know, how it should work, but it's a lot to keep your head around no matter what. And so in the process of doing this, one of the things that they wanted to do most was control the unplanned shutdowns, because this machine is so valuable to the company that uses it and runs out the paper sheets, that they don't want downtime. It's like having a Boeing Dreamliner sitting on the tarmac and not going anywhere for a whole day when the machine is shut off. They're losing money. And so shutdowns are really huge for them. And then the other thing that they were struggling with was something called consumables. Now, I call them felts and belts because it rhymes, but it's felts, it's belts, it's chemicals, it's rollers, it's different things that go in this machine and have to be replaced periodically. With all this pressure and all this heat and all these chemicals, things wear out. And so that leads to planned downtime. And you'd like to get rid of some of that, too. You'd like to minimize that. So they put in this case, they used Aster Analytics from Teradata. It was a software-only solution. They didn't want a data warehouse. It's a relatively small company. They really aren't huge, but the machines are huge. And so they really had a data warehouse on a SQL server. They were happy with that. But what they needed was an analytic solution to figure out all these sensors and what they were doing. To try to make the story a little shorter, they were in competition with some Asian companies, let's say, that were actually providing the felts and belts and all the consumables at a knockoff price. And by using the analytic capabilities of all these sensors, they were able to determine that, you know what, all the customers that were having more and more planned downtime were using these knockoff items. And the consumables that the original company, the producer of the machine, the ones that they were selling were a little more expensive, but they lasted so much longer. And so that meant they could send their salespeople back in with these reports and just say, hey, Richard, look at this. You know, if you use our consumables, it'll cost a little bit more up front, but you'll actually have 2 or 3 or even 5 fewer planned outages this year, which actually offsets the cost of the consumables substantially. And the result was a $35 million return on investment in the first year, just using analytics of sensors. Next slide. This one's fun. So now we have a silicon foundry that had grown and grown and grown. We all use their products. We all have pieces of their silicon in our machines, in our iPads, in our phones, what have you. And they had started out as manufacturing these silicon wafers, but they grew and grew, and they grew into the Philippines, into the Malaysia, and then off into the northeast of the United States and around the world. And before long, they had fabrications of sites all over the place. The downside was that every one of these machines that was building these semiconductor wafers was spitting out these files. All this sensor data was coming out. And the consequence is they now had 30,000 files a day that they had to get their arms around. Well, you can imagine that every fabrication plant did it differently, that the files were over here. No, we left a few over there. Oops, we dropped 5 on the floor. Before long, they were finding it very difficult to analyze all of this data. Now, since a lot of the things going on in the fabrication process are very hard and very high-tech, this is where they needed that bigger magnifying glass. It was one thing to analyze one particular step and figure it out, but when you wanted to see the interaction of multiple steps along the manufacturing line, you had to pull that magnifying glass way back up and look at the whole process all at once, and now you have a real big data problem on your hands. That plus 30,000 files scattered all over the world. So what happened here was interesting. This actually happened about the time that Teradata was getting ready to buy Think Big, and Think Big is an open source contract company, a system integrator, and most of their work is on Hadoop, although they do some of the other stuff. So we acquired them, and they had been working on this project, and what they did was they built some software that, in fact, went out into all of the remote locations, and it would gather up all those files, package them up, put them in a zip file, if you will, and ship them into a data lake, which, of course, they were also building the data lake. So this was sort of like a data integration process, and they bring this data in, put it into the data lake, and now they've got some software on the receiving side, sorts it out, makes sure all the files arrived on time, correctly, packages up, and starts doing the data integration. Once the data integration is done, they can use the data both in the data lake and the data warehouse, and this cuts back an awful lot on root cause problems in bad yields when the wafers go bad in the manufacturing process. When we first learned about this story, it was really pretty cool, all this movement of data around the world. But now what's happened is Teradata's Think Big organization has donated this software to the Apache open source, I think it is. I don't know which open source it went to, but they're making it open. It's called Kylo. So it's free, and you certainly will, hopefully we'll get some contributors